Everyone. This is Black DVM Network's Topic Rounds. Today we are with Dr. Terry Spencer, and she'll be talking about an online graduate program in shelter medicine and obviously what it can do for you. And so just a couple of quick announcements. First of all, thank you guys for being here. I know we're all tired of the Zoom meetings, but they're pretty fun sometimes. It's Black History Month, so we are really excited to be rolling out a ton of events on Zoom. This month, earlier in the month, we did Itchy Skin Rounds with Doctors Tasha Stark and Melanie French. And then last week we had Black History Month Trivia Night, which was really fun. We gave away some prizes. This week, we will be talking to Dr. Tasha Stark about being a Black woman in the veterinary industry as an entrepreneur. So she started her own business, which is pretty unique in vet med. It's not a practice. It's a little bit different. So she'll be talking to us about that on Wednesday at 7 p.m. All of our events, or most of our events this month, are on Wednesday. If you can't make that one, the week after that, we are doing an all Black Lives Matter panel with Pride BMC, and we're going to be talking about the intersectionality of being Black and LGBTQ plus in the veterinary community. And then our last final event is with the Multicultural Veterinary Medical Association, where we'll be unveiling of sorts Black veterinary graduates, the first female and male for the schools that we could get from each school. So that's going to be really cool. We have a really nice video put together to honor those Black pioneers in vet med. And then for the entire month of February, we are celebrating with a month-long fundraiser with the Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity group. And they are an organization that fights for equity in the animal welfare space. And so we're raising money for them, which they are giving to a veterinary student as in the form of a scholarship. Our goal is on GoFundMe, and it's a $10,000 goal in collaboration with the National Association for Black Veterinarians. But CARE on their own have already raised about $80,000, $50,000 of which came from Maddie's fund. So really exciting things. If you can't contribute, which I know that everyone is, in their own way, giving some time, space, energy, please just share the GoFundMe link. It's in all of our emails. It's on our social media channels. So help us spread the word there and reach our $10,000 goal. Okay, I think that's everything. All of our announcements. If you have any questions about anything, please let me know. We'll be doing a calendar giveaway at the end of this event. And we also have calendars for sale on our website. All of those proceeds are going to the CARE fundraiser. Okay, so without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Terry Spencer. She is the program director for the University of Florida online graduate program in shelter medicine. That's the disclosure here. And she advises students who are pursuing a master's concentration in shelter medicine and supervises capstone project research and presentations, and then coordinates faculty who are developing new courses and teaching online. So she's going to have a lot to tell us about this program. So thank you so much, Dr. Spencer, for being with us today.
It is definitely my honor to be here, and I coordinate our grand rounds for shelter medicine every week for all of our students. So I know how hard that is, and just listening to all the things that you have coordinated here for your network is amazing. And I think it's so wonderful that you're working with James Evans from CARE, because I know he's raising that money for the Dr. Blackwell scholarship. And wow, you've got a good goal. And I didn't know James had raised that much money, so amazing. So thank you for having me tonight. So good evening, and I can't really see how many people are here or look at the chat window while I'm talking. So I apologize, but I'm sure someone will interrupt me if something's going on and I need to know about it. So tonight, it's my plan to give us all a little bit of shared background about shelter medicine, so we're all kind of speaking a common language. And then hopefully it will have lots of time for questions at the end. So I can't see you, but I do know now, just from chatting in the beginning, that a few of you actually work in animal sheltering. So that's cool. So some of this might be not so new to you, but even if you do work in one aspect of animal shelters, they come in such a huge variety that hopefully by giving you all a little common background tonight, we can all speak the same language, and it will give you some opportunities. So the first thing I want to say about shelter medicine is that it differs from veterinary practice. I worked in both sides of the veterinary world. And whereas in most veterinary practices, unless you're doing large animal work, you are working with an individual animal and an individual owner. In shelter medicine, we do individual animal medicine, but we also do population medicine. And so half of your time is working with the population, the other half is working with an individual animal. And so we actually do think of dogs and cats in these congregate living facilities as a herd of companion animals. And so there's a lot of similarities to the way you might manage a dairy herd. So we're going to go through a lot of that tonight. My plan tonight is not to just give you a sales pitch for the online shelter medicine program, but it's to help you know a little bit about the history of animal shelterings, a little bit about the future of animal shelters, what's involved in the scope of practice if you call yourself a shelter veterinarian, a few things about career opportunities, and if you do want to get some additional training, why that's important and how it can be from the University of Florida can maybe facilitate that for you. So let me first tell you that the online graduate program in shelter medicine, which is a big mouthful, what that means is we have a graduate certificate in shelter medicine, which currently is 5 courses or 15 credits. It started out originally just as 3 courses or 9 credits, and over the past decade where I've been working with the program, we've grown. And for the last 5 or 6 years, we've actually had a master's concentration in shelter medicine that includes those 15 credits of the core certificate, plus another 15 credits of electives of your choice. And I can show you what those electives are. So let's start with the beginning. Animal sheltering in the United States began in the mid-1800s, or maybe even a little earlier, but it started as animal control. It was never a shelter. So the first arm has always been animal control. And the reason for that was it was initiated because of livestock running free throughout the streets that were causing problems, and also packs of stray dogs that could transmit rabies, which was common because we didn't have rabies control then. So these animals were all rounded up and brought to a central facility where they were sold by the pound. They weren't adopted. So when you're selling something by the pound, that's where the dog pound came from. But most people didn't want to buy the dogs. Those were brutally, not humanely euthanized. They were clubbed and drowned and all kinds of things because we didn't have real adoption programs for those animals then. But some of the livestock would have been sold by the pound. And in about 1868 or so, there was the very first time that we know of that a humane animal shelter was started. Instead of just an animal control facility, a lady in Philadelphia actually created the first facility that was designed to give veterinary or medical care and support to these animals. That's the very first time we could use the term shelter, okay? And around the same time, around 1866 or 1868, was when the ASPCA was actually formed in New York City by Henry Berg. And Henry Berg was not at all interested in animal control or animal sheltering. He was only interested in preventing animal cruelty. And so he formed the ASPCA out of his disgust at watching how the horses that were mostly used for transportation were trained and beaten and cared for. So he started the organization to help promote, and actually did, create some of the very first anti-animal cruelty laws that were on the books that could be enacted in municipalities and states and in national governments. And that amazingly happened even before there were anti-child cruelty laws. So child abuse was not protective, but animal cruelty was starting to be protected. It took them another 8 years before this little girl, Mary, who you see on the cover of that book, she'd been orphaned during the Civil War and was adopted into a home where the adoptive mother was brutally beating this girl. And so he intervened and prosecuted that case in court. And so that began child protection as well. So we have 3 arms of animal sheltering, and that's pertinent to our discussion because all 3 arms continue today. So there's animal control, there's animal sheltering and there's animal welfare, okay? Now, Henry Berg didn't even want to do animal control. He didn't let the organization do it until after he died, and the ASPCA then just took on animal control and animal cruelty investigations. They've since kind of gotten out of municipal animal control, and they've turned over some of their forensic investigations back to police departments, but they still do all kinds of excellent work in animal welfare and in helping to support those forensic investigations. So sheltering has 3 arms, but it has many names, okay? And so almost everywhere you go in the United States, there's an animal shelter of some sort in a location, but they may have any kind of name. They might be called animal care and control, and they might be run by a municipal government, and that shelter's main function may be animal control and rabies prevention. Or they might be called the SPCA of X county, okay? But that doesn't mean by having the name SPCA that they're in any way connected with the ASPCA in New York. Or they might be called the Humane Society of Town A, but they're in no way connected to the national organization that's known as HSUS. So the point to that conversation is that there is no oversight to animal shelters. Animal shelters don't fall under the Federal Animal Welfare Act, so they're not regulated by the USDA. And there is no central agency that sets standards for animal shelters. There are some local laws that may have some requirements of animal shelters, but I only know of 3 states that require any kind of data collection and reporting by animal shelters, and that's Colorado, Virginia, and Florida. Although Florida requires data collection, but they don't require data reporting. So they're all over the place. And you will also hear them called by a variety of other names. You'll hear them called managed admissions, limited admissions, adoption guarantee facilities, and you will hear some terms like no-kill shelter or high-kill shelter. You'll even hear a new term that's popped up called socially conscious sheltering because some terms are not very well received in the field. So the terminology is very confusing, and it's very difficult to tell from the name of a shelter whether it has a nonprofit status and might be governed by a board of directors, or if it's a municipal agency and it might be governed by an elected board of county commissioners, or if it's some hybrid of those two, because a lot of nonprofit shelters will take on the local municipal control contract, okay? But there's other agencies. There's rescue groups that may not have a shelter, that their animals are all in foster homes. There's high-quality, high-volume spay-neuter facilities that we involve in the animal sheltering field. And there's even a few sanctuaries that take animals for their lifetime, such as Best Friends in Utah is a sanctuary. So they're all over the place. But what you don't want to say to a shelter, if you're going to go in for an interview, work there, or support your local shelter in some way, you don't want to call it the Pound, okay, because that's back in the 1800s, okay? And you don't want to call it a kill shelter or start using that terminology because it's very divisive, and I'll give you the history of those words in a bit. And you don't want to call your animal control officer the dog catcher, okay? Those things are just not acceptable in terms of socially conscious sheltering. So we started back at the beginning, and let's talk about how did it modernize. We didn't start modernizing animal shelters until the late 1900s. So, and that actually began, whereas sheltering itself began on the East Coast, the modern movement for sheltering began on the West Coast. And it began in around 1995 or 6 when a man named Rich Avancino, who was the director of the SPCA of San Francisco, decided that he didn't want to see so much euthanasia going on in the animal shelters in California. And he actually was one of the first to promote the term of no-kill, that SPCA of San Francisco was going to become a no-kill facility. And that no-kill name just kind of sent a ripple across the world. So once you drop a pebble into water and the ripples go out, he dropped that terminology. It became very divisive, and people had their eyes opened to how many animals were being euthanized in the California animal shelters. We didn't have a big database of evidence back then, and nobody really knew what to do, but it made common sense. And so the legislature of California passed what was known as the Hayden Bill, because Tom Hayden, one of the representatives, is who promoted it. And the Hayden Bill was made with all kinds of good intentions. And what that bill did was they made the assumption that the reason there were so many dogs and cats in shelters is because their owners couldn't find them. And they were only being held for 3 days. And so if we just held those animals with a longer stray hold period, that would give their owners more time to come and find them. So the Hayden Bill doubled the amount of time that the animals had to stay in those county or city, and it made everything worse. It made it horrible, because we now know that length of stay in an animal shelter means almost everything. And the longer that animal stays in the shelter, the higher the risk of it having physical health problems, behavioral health problems, and ending up being euthanized. And so that's exactly what happened in California. The animal shelters were quickly overwhelmed. There was much more illness, and there was much more death. And so it did not have the intended consequences. About that same time, Maddie's Fund was created. And Rich Avancino, who had started as the executive director of the SPCA in San Francisco, moved over to direct Maddie's Fund. Maddie's Fund was started by a private family who inherited or made their money in technology in California, and they set out to make things better for the animals. And you will see Maddie's name on almost everything in the animal sheltering world now, and they have been the benefactors and the promoters of this really becoming a professional discipline. They actually funded the very first resident who became the very first shelter medicine specialist, and that's Dr. Kate Hurley, who had been an animal control officer in Santa Cruz, California, went to vet school at Davis, and then stayed on with money from Maddie's Fund to be the very first person to try to look at, well, what is shelter medicine and how can we make a difference? Because we didn't know anything, okay? While she was working on that residency, she and Lila Miller, who was Dr. Lila Miller back on the East Coast at the ASPCA in New York City, wrote the very first textbook in 2004, very first one ever published on shelter medicine for veterinarians and staff. And then the same year, as we're just now starting to collect enough data about shelters to write books, Rich Avancino woke up and said, that no-kill name was causing lots of problems in animal sheltering, and surely we can come up with better words and better ways to describe what's happening in animal shelters. So they went out to the Asilomar Beach in California, and they developed the Asilomar Accords, which became the standard for quite a few years for how animal shelters would collect data. And they'd start classifying animals by their health status at admission, whether they came in healthy or they had a treatable condition or they were unhealthy when they came in, and started promoting the collection of data about how were your animals coming in and how were they leaving the shelter. The next year is the very first year that the professional organization, the Association of Shelter Veterinarians, organized. Then the very first official training of students, veterinary students in shelter medicine, began around then. There was just a handful of schools, the University of Florida being one of them. And in 2010, the ASV published the landmark ASV Guidelines of Standards for Care in Animal Shelters, of which that's the benchmark by which all shelters now judge themselves, whether they are meeting those standards or not. I came along at the same time to the University of Florida, helped them get their graduate certificate in shelter medicine going by 2011. 3 years later, Shelter medicine is a boarded specialty that's recognized by the AVMA and handled as a specialty practice under ABVP. By 2015, I graduated the very first student who earned a master's with a concentration in shelter medicine, who's gone on to be the medical director of one of the largest animal shelters in the US. And then 2020 happened. And 2020 changed everything in everything, but it changed everything in animal sheltering as well. And so we are now having a new paradigm shift in sheltering, where it's not just about how can we care for the animals inside the shelter, it's about how can we prevent those animals from ever coming into the shelter, keeping them in their loving homes or their homes outside of the shelter. So big changes are coming. So that quick history was to show you that when we weren't focusing on animals, like in 1970, there were many, the per capita rate of euthanasia was huge. And by the time we get to 2010, the per capita rate of euthanasia in animal shelters is much lower. And you would think that all of that focus and all of that research that was done into shelter medicine was what caused this. But I want you to see that everything in sheltering is connected to everything else. And while this graph is something we should celebrate, it isn't just because people opened their eyes and learned how to manage shelters better. This is because we started to have fewer animals come into the shelter, and the intake rate to your shelter is directly tied to your euthanasia rate. And so that intake rate isn't shown here. But the way we reduce the intake rate to shelters was by instituting high quality, high volume spay-neuter and really focusing on reducing the population of animal shelters. And that has been one of the most significant interventions that was just the low-hanging fruit out there. Let's stop these animals from reproducing so they don't come into the shelters. That made a huge difference. So what we do now in animal sheltering is we actually assess the operations of the shelters. And you can do that as a boarded specialist. You can do that as part of a university team that goes out. You can be with one of the national organizations that goes out, like ASPCA or Million Cat Challenge will go out and do shelter consultations to help you look at your operations and improve them to make them more efficient and better care for the animals. And how we train our students to do this too, to work as a coach for your local animal shelter and know what all the best practices are and how you can implement them. So there are many pieces of operations in animal shelters. There's everything from the facility care and how do you disinfect it and clean it and prevent the spread of diseases? How do you transport animals in and out of it? How do you keep them physically, behaviorally healthy? How do you do rabies control for the community? How do you manage the population? How do you keep your records and report them out so they're standardized? How do you do humane euthanasia, and how do you choose who's going to be euthanized and why and justify that? All of those things affect the health of the organization. And as we were trained in vet school, we do a standardized physical exam on animals and write up our SOAP. You do almost exactly the same thing when you're doing a consultation or coaching a shelter. You're going to look at all of those pieces and you're going to write a SOAP. So first, you're going to go in and look subjectively at the shelter and gather all of that information about what kind of mission is it? How is it funded? What's its board of directors like? What is its community? Who does it serving? Okay. Then you're going to go in and do the TPR. You're going to take all the metrics, the objective part of the assessment. You're going to look at how many animals do they serve per year? What types of animals? Are they younger? Are they older? Are they healthy? Are they treatable? Are they unhealthy? Are they, how many come in of different age groups? Do you have a pattern that changes over the year where you are overwhelmed with kittens some seasons and not in others? Do you have problems with infection rate? What is your infectious disease rate? What is your euthanasia rate? So all of that data, before you assess it and identify all the problems that could be addressed. You identify the strengths, you identify the weaknesses, which areas of those operations aren't meeting the ASV guidelines, how can we help them to get there, and you make a plan that involves metrics. Okay, so we're going to do this to lower your diet and care stats, and we're going to measure it after so many days, and we're going to implement all these changes. So it's really something familiar to all of us as veterinarians. What's less familiar is that all of those operations while you have to look at them independently, everything in the shelter is connected to everything else, okay? So every decision that's made in every operation affects the outcome of the shelter. So it's best to think of the shelter as a system in three parts. All those parts that make up the intake, so the animals as they're arriving to the shelter or immediately before they arrive to the shelter, all of those operations that affect the health of the shelter once they're inside it. So are we having some animals in quarantine, some in isolation? Are some being held long-term for legal cases? Are some of these owner-requested services that we're doing? And we have to look at all of the operations that affect outcomes, our adoptions program, our fosters program, our transfers program, even our euthanasia, okay? And every part affects every other part. So let me give you an example, a simple negative connection. So at intake one day, you bring in the animals, but we're short-staffed because people went out for COVID, and all the animals that came in that day didn't get their intake vaccine. They were delayed by 24 to 48 hours. That caused all the animals to be at risk for the infectious disease soup within that shelter, and many of them do get sick, which causes our veterinarians to have to treat more and our care staff to give more medications and more animals to die, which decreased our live outcomes. So one simple intake mistake could increase the diet and care or the euthanasia rate, but it could also positively affect it. So let's say it's the middle of kitten season and some good Samaritan finds some orphan baby kittens in their yard and they bring them to the shelter like we trained them to do. And at that shelter, the front desk is empowered to hand out bottle baby kits. And they ask the Good Samaritan to take a bottle baby kit and please go home and bottle feed these kittens for another 2 to 3 weeks until they're weaned and they're big enough at 1.5 pounds that they can come back to the shelter and be spayed and immediately adopted, so they don't have to stay. And that simple decision made it so much easier for the kennel staff and the veterinary staff to care for the animals they already had in place and get them adopted out to make a few more rooms or a few more cage spaces ready for that kitten litter when it arrives. And so then it increased the positive outcomes for everybody. So all of the parts are connected to everything else, but they're all built on animal welfare. And animal welfare is the foundation of modern animal sheltering. And if we don't meet the animal welfare needs, we can't keep the shelter healthy and we can't keep the pets in our care behaviorally or physically healthy. So the ASB guidelines that I told you were the benchmark for how we measure the standards of care are built around the 5 freedoms, and there's 4 freedoms from things and only 1 freedom to do something. And those freedoms are written in the guidelines as these are ideal practices or things you should be doing or things you must be doing or things you should never do in the shelter. And we have to do those all the time, okay? That's how we provide the best possible care and we have the most live outcomes from the shelter by providing those 5 freedoms. Those were built in 1965. They were originally made in the United Kingdom for livestock, but they apply to all kinds of animals. There's been some disgruntlement with the 5 freedoms that they don't focus enough on what animals should be able to do. And so the ASB is actually revising the guidelines for standards of care. They're under revision at this point, and we're actually moving on to start to look at the quality of life that we're providing for the animals in our care. So we're starting to move about whether the animal is being offered a life that's worth living, and that will help you make decisions about whether you're providing good care or the animal is suffering in your care. And so if you match this to the 5 freedoms, what we'd want to do is provide all of the 5 freedoms all of the time. And if we do that, we would offer up in the green bar the very high quality of life. That's where a sanctuary should be. If an animal's going to live with you its entire life, you have to have all the 5 freedoms all of the time to provide the highest quality of life you can. Okay, an animal shelter itself is probably somewhere in the middle, like the orange transitioning area. It's not a natural environment. It's not normal for a dog or a cat to live in a cage for weeks at a time and not be able to go out and play or have human interaction or be able to play with its other types of dogs or cats in its care. So we don't provide all of the 5 freedoms all of the time. So this is not an ideal place for an animal to be, and that's why we want their length of stay to be as short as possible. But down in the bottom, if you're not meeting all the 5 freedoms any of the time, that's where we probably prosecute for cruelty and animal neglect. And believe it or not, there have been shelters that have been prosecuted for animal cruelty and neglect, and they're victims of trying to become a no-kill facility without having all of the infrastructure and resources in place to make that possible. And so they become institutional hoarders instead of animal shelters and animal welfare providers. I can think of 3 instances off the top of my head where the shelters were accused of cruelty. One was here in Memphis, where I actually live. Another is in Las Vegas, Nevada, where I worked most recently, and another is in Toronto, Canada. But I will tell you, from having been at the very bottom of the bottom, those 3 shelters have turned around to become the top and premier shelters in the U.S. They meet all of the ASB guidelines. They have followed all of the welfare recommendations. They've had formal consultations. Their government and their boards of directors support them, and they've turned it all around, okay? So it is possible. And how we do that in our courses is we have a few things that really matter, that we're critical, and you will see in different courses presented in different ways, and sometimes we have whole courses devoted to it. The most important thing, and that scares people the most, is that metrics matter, okay? You have to know the numbers, and you have to report those numbers, and you have to calculate them in common ways that we're comparing apples to apples when we're comparing shelters. That's been a huge problem ever since the beginning of the modern animal sheltering movement. But the good news is that these numbers and these calculations are all based on epidemiology. So if you know epidemiology and you have heard of rates, then you can calculate shelter metrics. Okay, so we have a book that we use in our courses called Every Nose Counts. Teaches you those epidemiology formulas and how to calculate a live release rate or a euthanasia rate or a save rate, and know the difference between the 3. And we have now an organization called Shelter Animals Count that helps organizations voluntarily collect their data and define their data in a common way and report it every month in something called a basic data matrix. And that's available out on the Shelter Animals Count website. So you can begin to compare shelters in different regions of the country, shelters of different sizes, and start to compare, well, what is my save rate in my shelter in the Southeast, and how does that compare to other shelters of my size in the Southeast? So you're not comparing yourself to the ASPCA in San Francisco, which is super well-resourced, because you're just a little animal control agency somewhere in the middle of Alabama. Okay, so we're beginning to collect this data, and more and more shelters are joining, and it's super important to guiding us in our care of the animals in the shelter. The other thing is that evidence matters. So back when Kate Hurley was first starting her residency, there probably up to that point only been 150 published papers that mention shelter medicine or animal shelters in them at all. Okay, since the ASB formed and the shelter practice, or the boarded specialty has come about, I bet you there's 800 to 1,000 papers that have been published with the term animal shelter in it now. So we're collecting evidence about evidence-based practice in animal shelters, and much of this evidence refutes myths that we believed about sheltering in the past. Okay, and just like the Hayden bill was made on good intentions, we can't run shelters on good intentions because bad things happen. So we have to know evidence. So our courses are built around all of these textbooks and all of these papers. And so we have Lila Miller's and Kate Hurley's Shelter Medicine Veterinarians for Veterinarians and Staff book that's in its 2nd edition. We have an Animal Behavior for Shelter Veterinarians and Staff. We have Infectious Disease Management for Animal Shelters, which Dr. Miller is right now publishing the new 2nd edition of that. We have whole books on high quality, high volume spay neuter and other shelter surgeries. And for instance, in our grand rounds, which will be Wednesday night, I have 2 specialty or shelter medicine surgeons that will be giving new tips and tricks for other surgeries they invented for perianal hernias that can be done in the shelter environment. We have international shelter medicine, so a field manual there for doing spay neuter in less resourced countries, or also for doing street dog programs say in India, or helping bring down dog meat industry in Southeast Asia. And we have the best practice playbook that we use in our course about life-enhancing strategies so that you can become a coach and learn to work with the different types of organizations and how to guide them to all the evidence for why you would build a community cat program, or why you would do teach your animal control officers to do community-based practice instead of enforcement only in the field. We also know that terminology matters. Like I told you before, there's some terms that are offensive in sheltering, but we know now that veterinarians in private practice can't always understand even the terms that we're using in shelter medicine because they didn't exist in their training. So when we talk about live release rate, or LRR, or we talk about capacity for care, those words all have specific meanings in shelter medicine that we all need to understand, but they may mean nothing to any other veterinarian. So there's a lot of specialty knowledge that has to come. There's just tons of it. So all those words matter. It also matters when you're the leader of a shelter, and many shelter veterinarians actually become directors or medical directors or operations directors for shelters or run their own nonprofits. But knowing something about how to lead and how to manage is super important. And we weren't all given that kind of training in veterinary schools. So knowing your funds and your fundraising and about development, knowing how to manage staff, how to train staff, how to calculate how many staff you need to care for the animals that you have on population, knowing what resources are available and what you should be using for cleaning supplies and PPE, and how to keep your staff safe from zoonotic diseases, as well as properly kill infectious diseases, knowing things like quaternary pneumonia, or things labeled parvosol, don't kill parvo, because evidence shows that they don't. Learning how to use other types of cleaning agents like rescue, which is an accelerated hydrogen peroxide, knowing how to manage volunteers, recruit volunteers, retain fosters, train them. All of that is super important, and it can change how you make decisions every single day in the shelter. Perhaps you're the best resource shelter in the county, but you have to take in 500 animals or 500 cats from a hoarding situation tomorrow. So you have to empty the shelter because you can't care for an additional 500 animals. So the decisions you make today may not be the ones you would have made last week. So knowing how to lead and to manage those resources is super important. And then I'll say something about who's attracted to work in this field. So communication matters in all aspects of veterinary medicine, but it's really important in shelter medicine. And a lot of veterinarians get disgruntled in private practice because working with clients is very hard, okay? And communicating with those clients and trying to get them to follow your recommendations. And some of our clients are really, frankly, ornery, okay? So we know that in private practice, a lot of veterinarians want to leave and come to shelter medicine because they just don't want to work with those clients anymore. That's a bad mistake, because in the shelter, every animal doesn't have an owner on the end of the leash. They have an entourage on the end of the leash. And you have to work with a team of people to care for this population of animals. And that team of people has someone looking over your shoulder from every angle that has invested in that animal that you're caring for. You have volunteers, fosters, board of directors, the potential adopters. You have community members that know nothing about your shelter, but they heard you were a kill shelter. You have to be able to communicate with all of those, even owners who are coming with their pets to get spay-neutered, or they're coming because they couldn't afford vaccines somewhere else, so they come to your low-cost wellness clinic. It's a mistake to think that communication is not important in sheltering, because it's super important. And if you do it wrong, it can bring the shelter down. Shelters are beat up on social media, just like veterinarians are sometimes beat up. But if a shelter gets beat up on social media, it can impact them in every possible way. It can make them harder to find fosters, harder to find volunteers, and harder for them to raise money. So it could cause more euthanasia just by not communicating well. But I told you the future is outside the walls because of COVID, and that is a really exciting time to be in shelter medicine, where we're trying to prevent animals from ever having to come there and not even have to have a shelter anymore. That'll probably never happen. There's always going to be cruelty cases and completely homeless animals that need our care, but we want to minimize those. And part of this is coming from a landmark paper that came out of the University of Tennessee by the Access to Veterinary Care Coalition. In 2018, they published this article. We use this this report. We use this in our community and public health course as well, that there is a huge problem with pet owners having pets but not being able to access veterinary care. It's for every reason from they might live in a veterinary desert where there actually are no practices located where they can take their pets to, and that's very common, and you can map that on a GPS. Okay, it could also just be that they were temporarily lost their job due to COVID and they are now struggling. They used to be middle class and now they are on unemployment benefits. They can't no longer afford care, but they love their pets, okay, and they need help. Or it could be they're getting evicted, okay, all kinds of reasons why access to veterinary care is a problem. And this frustrates private practitioners to no end, and I think it causes a lot of the mental health issues that we have in our profession. But we have solutions, and they're coming, and they are outside the box thinking. One of those solutions is to provide something like a Medicare or a Medicaid plan for pet owners. We don't have that because we don't usually do a lot of human-animal support services in animal sheltering. But Align Care is now in pilot programs in about 30 or 40 cities across the U.S., and this is a program that brings together a human social worker to work with these clients and screen them and figure out what their needs are for pets, match them up with private veterinary practices in the community that have agreed to work with Align Care. And the owner has to have a copay that they agree to pay. And then the rest of the funds will come from Align Care to that veterinarian who agrees to treat the animal. But this is all using sort of a more common sense approach that the social worker can work with the client instead of the veterinarian having to negotiate always what I can do. Say the animal is coming to you and they have cancer. And a veterinarian's usually going to refer them or do cancer therapy. Well, the Align Care is not going to pay for that because treating that one animal for cancer therapy would mean they don't have enough funds to treat many more animals. So they might provide or pay for hospice care, but they're not going to pay for chemotherapy. And so working with veterinarians to have a handful of different incremental care plans that they are willing to provide is important in this kind of model. There's also coming down the line whole new veterinary business models. Here's an example called Open Door, where they're really a for-profit business, but they're learning ways to incorporate the usually underserved population of pet owners that they used to get frustrated with, for them to pay, like Align Care or having different things other than care credit, which most people can't qualify for anyway, and providing ways to have a whole new population of client base that you're serving that wouldn't have been served before and still keeping your hospital profitable. So careers in animal shelters. It's not just veterinarians who are doing shelter medicine. Veterinarians are super important, and I'm not minimizing that. And when the ASV did its job task analysis to try to make the creation of a practice specialty in shelter medicine, they learned that there were 8 conceptual areas of 69 specific skills that are different for the practice of shelter medicine compared to the practice of regular veterinary medicine. And so within there, these are all the things that we teach online in our program. We do physical health, behavioral health, public health and safety, cruelty, animal neglect, big picture strategies at reaching outside and community engagement to alleviate homelessness. We teach model ordinances for public policy, like what are the model ordinances for dangerous dog laws, for community cat programs, how to advance shelter medicine, how to do effective communication to different audiences, and about shelter management. But you can do more than that. Veterinary technicians, they're forming their own specialty. So there's about to be an association of shelter veterinary technicians. There's also animal control has its own professional organization where they are certified by the National Animal Care and Control Association to learn to do community enforcement and not just legal enforcement and investigations. And many of our veterinarians and while they go on to be leaders in the shelter, some of them have actually become certified animal welfare administrators through the Association for Animal Welfare Advancement. But those animal welfare advancement certificates, they don't have to be a veterinarian to learn how to do proper sanitation or run transport programs or look at their metrics or gather their metrics. So there's lots of different opportunities for professionals in the shelter. There was one paper just published last year that looks at the salaries and conditions for shelter vets. And the last time that survey was done was in 2011. So we have a 7-year gap looking at that. And I will tell you that in this paper that they looked at the aggregating service called Indeed.com, and were able to identify 1,000 ads looking for shelter vets to work in animal shelters. So there are opportunities out there for those who want to work in animal shelters. It is not easy, and it's not easy to get up to speed if you've only been doing private practice, but it is possible to do. When shelter veterinarians were first working in shelters, they were underpaid. You can see that in the survey, and they weren't making as much as private practitioners, and that was one of the reasons it was hard to recruit veterinarians. And if you did recruit them, they overworked them to no end and abused them. But they're hiring lots of more shelter vets because they know what we can do now. And the salary, median average salary, is about equal to the private practice median as reported by the AVMA. So they're better paid now, and they have better benefit packages. It's still hard work. Many shelter vets still do work part-time, or they might even be doing relief shifts, but the demographics of animal sheltering is still the same as regular practice. It's 90% female. I would tell you that it's probably 90% or more not people of color. But the age group is a little bit older. It's a harder thing so far for new grads to come out and be a successful shelter veterinarian right off the bat, unless they came from a few schools that have significant training in shelter vet. They need to probably go somewhere where they can be mentored by a more experienced shelter vet, but that's similar to private practice too. But a lot of shelter vets are a little bit older, have worked in the practice or worked as a veterinarian about a decade, and have been in the shelter world about 5 years. But it's growing more and more common for these shelter vets to have an advanced degree or even have done an internship, and a handful have done residencies. So this is the website for the program that I run, and on here we can explore this later if you want. You can learn about all the different courses that we teach and what's involved in getting a degree or a graduate degree. We're about to roll out some continuing education or professional development courses where you don't have to actually be a degree-seeking student, but those aren't available yet. I can talk about those later if you want. Here's some examples of titles of courses that we teach, like in behavior or metrics or public health. But we also do things that I didn't talk about, like veterinary disaster response, okay? And I've talked enough, so I am gonna maybe stop sharing my screen and hope I didn't bore you too much and answer any questions that you might have. So I see there were some things going on in the chat, that's good. I only see the last few things. Okay. So who works in shelter med? You work at your city's animal shelter kennels, but you volunteer in the medical department and shadow the vet when I can. Good for you. What city is that, Emma? I'll scroll down in a minute. And then you volunteer at one at home and one near your university. That's good, Treasure. And you work in Chicago. That's probably a big one. Way to go, Rachel. Lots of shelter people out here. I'm glad you're doing that. Wayside Waste. That's good. We've had people come through our program before that were Wayside Waste. One of them actually worked at Wayside Waste, took our degree, and then went off to be a forensic vet for the ASPCA. I remember that too. Let me keep scrolling down. Indianapolis, good, so all over the country. All right. Does anybody have any questions specific for me that you'd like to ask, or have me show you something else, or quit talking? Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to say thank you for listening, and I hope that no questions meant that maybe I overtalked, I'm sorry, or I didn't fill your needs, but I really appreciate you inviting me, and I would like to ask you guys a question. So we are been looking, shelter medicine has a problem, as does vet med, with diversity and inclusion and equity. When are the applications due? We accept them year round. So for the fall of 2021, they'd probably be due sometime in the summer. And on our website, if you look at our website, there's a tab that says critical dates. It will tell you in there. But I think we begin accepting applications probably in May or June for the fall admission. Okay. And we don't require the GRE anymore. There were some students that had gotten their veterinary degree in international schools, and UF used to require them to take the GRE, and we don't do that anymore. We finally got past that. Okay, so I was going to ask you a question about diversity and equity. So in shelter medicine, I think we have an even worse problem recruiting diverse groups of people, and because it's hard enough to get them into vet school, but then to get them into a specialty practice. My feeling is that happens, that we weed out students beginning much earlier, like that we weed out young people in high school or even middle school from thinking that they can pursue a degree in veterinary medicine or work in an animal shelter. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on ways that we might bring up the next generation of shelter vets and represent a more diverse universe. I can tell you that I've worked in shelters where, like in Las Vegas, it's a very diverse community. And we had a lot of Latino and Hispanic workers in the shelter, but we didn't have any that were management. And that to me is a huge problem. So I would invite you to give me your thoughts on that. Oops. Are you still there? I lost my screen. Uh-oh. I think I got kicked out of the room, but if you can still hear me.
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Okay, somehow I got bumped out of the room, but that's why I call in on my phone in case that happens. But I would invite you to give us ideas about that, because I was on a committee for the ASB to try to be more inclusive in shelter medicine, and I'm not sure that we have all the answers. I know we don't have all the answers, but I would also love for you guys to come and do a presentation to us at Grand Rounds sometimes to talk about, maybe you want to share with us how we could work to recruit more diverse groups in shelter medicine without, I'm just open to any ideas. If you type something in the chat, I won't be able to see it because I'm not in the room. Okay, so with that, thank you for letting me visit with you tonight, and I hope you gathered a little bit more about shelter medicine, and I hope to see some of you apply and join us online. We have a great time. We also have a journal club, an online journal club that we participate in. We have Grand Rounds where we invite guest speakers. Every week we've had James Evans speak to us and Michael Blackwell. We have the Pets for Life people, all kinds of people come and speak to us for Grand Rounds. We also have a virtual international exchange. We're currently working on a group project that we're doing a virtual shelter consult in Israel, where we learn about different practices or different ways and different cultures. For instance, in Israel, 50 to 60% of the animals are returned to owners. They don't ever stay in the shelter because Israel requires everybody to have a microchip, and they register those microchips on a state-funded website, and the veterinarians that boost the vaccines every year double check that your pet is registered on the website. And so it's as simple as that. The animals get back home. So thank you for having me here tonight, and I will say goodbye. Okay?
Yeah, well, thank you. I know, Dr. Spencer, you probably can't see us because you're on your phone now, but thank you so much for giving this talk and for sharing all of your expertise. That was such a good overview of shelter medicine and all the things that you can do in shelter med. And so I really, really appreciated that, that perspective. If anyone, missed any parts of this, there is a recording and it will be available. And if you need Dr. Spencer's contact information, feel free to reach out. But thank you all also for coming. I would love to hear from you guys. So I'll probably send out a feedback survey, a really short one, really just asking, what drew you into this meeting, and maybe if there was anything that you got out of it. I just want to hear from you guys. So be on the lookout for that.
And I'm open to feedback as well. So if you have comments, you want to tell me you hated something or would like more of something or wasn't clear, I'm open to any feedback. If you have additional questions, you can reach me at tspencer@ufl.edu. Okay.
Dr. Spencer, before you go, I was just wondering, for the master's program, do you have to complete because I think it was 30 credits total. Do you have to complete that all consecutively, or can you take certain courses first, or?
Yeah, you can take it in any order that you want. So if you're real interested in forensics, you can do forensics first, or you can do leadership first. We do ask you, though, to everybody that joins the program to start with one course that's called VME 6810. It's Integrating Veterinary Medicine with Shelter Systems, because it gives an overview of sheltering. So you get a little bit of physical health, a little bit of behavior, a little bit of forensics, a little bit of management, some spay neuter, those kinds of things. But it's designed to make you more comfortable with the online technology, because learning to learn online in a very interactive way is different. And as we all know, technology has gremlins, and so we want your experience to be as successful as possible. So we ask that you start there with that course.
Awesome, thank you. And
You're welcome.
as far as your question before, I think I'm actually on that committee with you with the ASB. So I'm excited to work with you a little bit more to try to figure out what's going on with shelter medicine and how we can increase our diversity.
Awesome.
But I think it's interesting because, it is really hard. And like you said, I do think there is a big disconnect of turning away members of our community at a younger age, whether it is just like the lack of support that we received. I mean, personally, I've received lack of support before applying to vet school that could have turned me away. But also, I think it's, the bigger issue is the lack of diversity within our whole field, and not seeing us as veterinarians and not seeing us in this capacity. I think that can also lead our community members to different areas within medicine at all. So, I mean, it's going to be a big battle, but I mean, hopefully we can make strides towards it. So.
Well, thank you for being on that committee too, because I think it's going to take a lot of thinking and a lot of effort, but it's worth it. So.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, thank you. All right, everybody. Good night.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Good night. Thank
You're
you.
welcome. I'm sorry that I